The massive convoy pushed through the narrow Ashford Gorge like a steel flood, squeezing through a crack in the mountains. Dozens of armored transports and support trucks hauled 620 Navy SEALs, stacks of gear, and enough weapons to tear half the region apart. Dawn slid over the eastern ridge and coated the jagged cliffs in rusty gold and faded red. It looked like the kind of beautiful morning that usually hinted nothing bad was coming. But anyone who'd spent time in Corville knew quiet moments were the ones that flipped into nightmares without warning. Inside the lead MATV, Chief Rowan Hale leaned in behind tinted lenses, tracking the slopes with the instinct of a man who'd lived through more ambush zones than he cared to count. Over 2 decades of running high-risk operations had carved a second sense into him, and right now every nerve in his body screamed like an alarm. Steep cliffs pressed tight on both sides, terrain practically inviting an enemy to perch above and let gravity do their killing. "I don't like this," he muttered into the radio without moving his jaw. Too damn silent. 2 vehicles back, Petty Officer First Class Mara Vance tightened the straps on her plate carrier and checked her customized rifle again, unable to shake the crawling tension up her spine. At 29, younger than most in the column, she had earned her place through a trail of hard-won combat experience across continents. Her dark hair was tied in a no-nonsense tactical bun, sharp eyes scanning everything with her usual steady precision. Officially, she was an intelligence specialist, meant to sit in cold rooms sorting satellite feeds. But the moment she heard the route cut through contested ground and learned the roster was 1 shooter short, she volunteered without hesitation. "Relax, Hale," came Lieutenant Commander Brex Dalton's voice over the net. "Intel says this sector's been quiet for weeks. We'll clear the valley in 20 minutes. Mara's brow tightened. Anytime someone said an area was calm, it usually meant the intel hadn't been refreshed since last payday. She shifted the rifle between her knees, the long-barreled, hand-tuned weapon she'd perfected over years, its trigger polished smooth and optic worth more than her entire car. At 0847, the illusion of safety snapped. The first RPG slammed into the 32nd vehicle, one of the heavy transports, erupting in a violent plume of black smoke and rolling flame that kicked the machine sideways like it weighed nothing. The shockwave punched through the line, rattling armor, teeth, and lungs. Before anyone could even swear, the valley exploded in gunfire. Hundreds of rounds per minute poured from both ridges, precise bursts ripping into the column with ruthless coordination. "Contact! Multiple angles!" Hale yelled as he fired from the window. "We're in a kill box." Mara was already moving, instincts taking over. She shoved the door open, dropped behind the engine block, and pressed into the metal as bullets sparked off the hood and carved spiderweb cracks through the armored glass. Her rifle snapped into place, scope rising to her eye as she hunted shapes among the rocks before her thoughts could catch up. Enemy fighters were dug into the high ridges on both sides, not just a scattered few, but hundreds, layered across firing points and waiting for the exact second the column of 620 SEALs hit the choke. It was planned with discipline, patient and methodical, the kind of ambush built by people who understood terrain like a blade. The convoy's return fire shook the valley, but with so many SEALs crushed into a narrow funnel, most shots were just suppression. Bullets sliced across the bottleneck, ricocheting off stone and forcing heads down while the enemy held every possible height advantage. "We need movement," Lieutenant Commander Dalton barked through static. "Forward or back, either way sitting here gets us killed. Both routes are locked down." Chief Rowan Hale fired toward a flashing muzzle hidden in the rock. "Step out from behind the armor, and we get shredded." That was when Mara Vance spotted it. A tiny seam in the enemy's overlapping kill zones, a natural blind spot cut into the terrain. If someone reached that ridge and hit the firing nests from the side, the pressure on the convoy might finally crack. The problem was the climb. Nearly 300 meters of open uphill ground under fire fierce enough to skin stone. For most people, it was suicide. But Mara Vance had never lived by the word most. "I'm moving," she said into her mic without waiting for permission. "Cover me." Her body dropped into a combat crouch, rifle tight as she launched forward. The SEALs immediately laid down a wall of suppressive fire, forcing enemy shooters to duck long enough for her to sprint. Rounds snapped past her helmet close enough to feel the air punch, and stone shards exploded around her boots. Her world shrank to a tunnel of noise, burning lungs and calculations firing faster than conscious thought. She slid behind a boulder just as a burst of automatic fire tore through the dirt she'd crossed half a second earlier. Her pulse hammered, but her hands stayed impossibly steady, the steadiness built from years of turning fear into fuel. A quick peek revealed her next cover. A shallow dip 20 meters ahead, maybe reachable. With enemy fire still pinned by friendly volleys, Mara burst from behind the rock, sprinting in a jagged zigzag that made tracking her nearly impossible. More rounds sliced past, some close enough to heat the air around her. She dove into the shallow depression like a runner sliding into home plate, rolled through the dust, and brought her rifle up in one fluid motion. From this position, she had clear angles on 3 firing nests. Settling into the dirt, she slowed her breathing, letting that familiar stillness wash through her. The strange calm that always settled over her the moment a scope pressed against her cheek. First target. A fighter crouched behind a wall of sandbags roughly 250 meters ahead. She watched the tiny flicker of his muzzle, tracked the subtle rise of his head as he shifted position, and let her reticle settle on the thin sliver of exposed forehead. One controlled squeeze. Clean drop. Second target, a gunman sprinting along the ridge, trying to find a sharper angle on the convoy. She led her shot on instinct alone, compensating for both speed and distance. Another smooth pull. Another body falling into the rocks. The ambushers finally sensed something was off. Precision fire was tearing into them from an angle they hadn't planned for, confusion rippling through their positions as fighters tried to relocate and find the hidden shooter, throwing their assault into chaos. But Mara Vance was already focused on her third target, a militant wrestling a heavy machine gun into place. The kind of weapon that could rip through armored trucks like cheap metal. She couldn't let that gun come alive. The range now stretched close to 300 meters, the wind dragging steadily right to left. She made a tiny correction, let her breath settle, and prepared to fire. The gusts kept nudging her aim, forcing Mara to flick her sights a hair tighter, feeling the pressure build as the valley behind her churned in chaos. The massive convoy pushed through the narrow Ashford Gorge like a steel river wedged into a crack in the mountains. Dozens of armored carriers and support trucks hauled 620 Navy SEALs, pallets of equipment, and enough firepower to shear half the region apart. Dawn had just slipped over the eastern ridge, painting the jagged stone in burnt gold and dusty red. The kind of gorgeous morning that normally signaled nothing dangerous was coming. But anyone who'd spent real time in Corville knew that quiet moments were the ones that flipped into nightmares without warning. In the lead MATV, Chief Rowan Hale leaned forward behind polarized lenses, scanning the slopes with the instinct of a man who'd survived more ambush corridors than he wanted to remember. More than 20 years in special operations had carved a sixth sense into him. And right now, every nerve in his body was ringing like an alarm. Sheer cliffs pressed against both sides of the pass, the kind of terrain that practically begged an enemy to perch above and let gravity do half the killing. "I don't like this," he muttered into the radio, barely moving his jaw. "Too damn quiet." 2 vehicles back, Petty Officer First Class Mara Vance tightened the straps on her plate carrier and checked her customized rifle yet again, unable to shake the prickling tension crawling up her spine. At 29, younger than most operators in the column, she had earned her place through a streak of hard-won combat experience that stretched across continents. Her dark hair was pulled into a no-nonsense tactical bun, sharp eyes flicking over everything with her usual steady precision. Officially, she was an intelligence specialist, someone meant to sit in chilled rooms sorting satellite feeds and building target decks. But the moment she heard the route cut through contested ground and realized the roster was short one shooter, she had thrown her name in without hesitation. "Relax, Hale," came Lieutenant Commander Brex Dalton's voice over the net. "Intel says this sector hasn't had activity in weeks. We'll clear the valley in 20 minutes. Mara's brow knit tighter. Anytime someone claimed an area was quiet, it usually meant the intel hadn't been updated since the last payday. She shifted the rifle between her knees, the long-barreled, hand-tuned weapon she had refined over years, its trigger polished smooth and optic worth more than her entire car. At 0847, the illusion of safety shattered. The first RPG slammed into the 32nd vehicle, a heavy transport, detonating in a violent plume of black smoke and rolling flame that knocked the machine sideways like it weighed nothing. The blast wave ripped through the line, rattling armor, teeth, and lungs. Before anyone could form a curse, the valley erupted in gunfire. Hundreds of rounds per minute poured from both ridges, precise bursts slicing into the column with ruthless coordination. "Contact. Multiple angles." Hale's voice cut through the chaos as he fired from the window. "We're in a kill box!" Mara was already moving, instincts overriding thought. She kicked open the door, dropped hard behind the engine block, and pressed into the hardened metal as bullets sparked across the hood and carved spiderweb fractures through the armored glass. Her rifle snapped into position, scope rising to her eye as she hunted shapes among the rocks before conscious thought caught up. Enemy fighters were dug deep into the high ridges lining both sides of the valley. Not just a scattered handful, but several hundred gunmen spread across layered firing points, all waiting for the exact moment the massive line of 620 SEALs hit the narrowest choke point. Their attack had been planned with discipline, patient, methodical, the kind of ambush crafted by people who understood terrain like a weapon. The convoy's return fire shook the valley, but with so many SEALs crammed into a tight funnel, most rounds were only suppression, not stopping power. Bullets tore across the bottleneck, ricocheting off stone, forcing heads down while the enemy held every height advantage imaginable. "We need movement," Lieutenant Commander Dalton barked over the radio, frustration grinding through static. "Forward or back, doesn't matter. Sitting here gets us killed. Both routes are locked down." Chief Rowan Hale fired a burst toward a flashing muzzle hidden deep in the rocks. "Step out from behind the armor, and we get shredded." That was when Mara Vance caught it. A faint seam in the enemy's overlapping kill zones, a small blind spot carved naturally into the terrain. If someone could reach that ridge and hit the firing nests from the flank, the pressure on the convoy might finally break. The problem was simple and brutal. It was nearly 300 meters of uphill, exposed ground under fire intense enough to peel rock. For most people, that kind of run was a straight suicide attempt, but Mara Vance had never built her life around the word most. "I'm moving," she said into her mic, not waiting for anyone to tell her she'd lost her mind. Lay down cover. She didn't stop for permission. Her body was already sinking into a combat crouch, rifle slung tight to her side as she launched forward. The SEALs caught on instantly, pouring a wall of suppressive fire into the ridgelines, forcing the enemy to duck long enough for her to sprint. Rounds cracked past her helmet close enough to feel the punch of air, and stone shards burst under her boots as she ran. Her world narrowed into a tunnel of sound, burning lungs and rapid-fire calculations faster than conscious thought. She slid behind a boulder the size of a small car, just as a burst of automatic fire tore through the dirt she'd crossed half a second earlier. Her heart hammered, but her hands remained impossibly steady, the steadiness she'd trained through years of turning raw fear into fuel. A quick glance showed her next cover point. A shallow dip in the ground about 20 meters ahead, possibly reachable. With friendly fire still hammering the ridges, Mara erupted from behind the rock, sprinting in a jagged zigzag that made her almost impossible to track. More rounds snapped past her, some close enough to heat the air around her. She dove into the depression like a runner sliding into home plate, rolled through the dust, and brought her rifle into firing position in one smooth motion. From this angle, she had clean shots on 3 firing nests. Settling into the dirt, she drew in a controlled breath, letting that familiar, unnerving calm settle over her. The strange quiet that visited her every time a scope touched her cheek. First target, a fighter tucked behind sandbags roughly 250 meters out. She watched the flicker of his muzzle, tracked the slight rise of his head, and let her reticle settle on the narrow strip of exposed forehead. One steady squeeze. Clean drop. Second target, a gunman sprinting along the ridge, trying to find a better line on the convoy. She led the shot on instinct, compensating for distance and movement. Another squeeze, another body falling. The ambushers now sensed something was wrong. Precision fire was cutting into them from an angle they hadn't planned for. Confusion rippling through the ridges as fighters scrambled to shift positions and locate the unseen sniper. But Mara was already dialed in on her third target, a fighter wrestling a heavy machine gun into place, the sort of weapon that could shred armored vehicles like aluminum cans. She couldn't let that gun come alive. The distance pushed close to 300 meters, wind dragging right to left. She made a tiny adjustment, let her breath settle, and prepared to fire. The gusts kept nudging her aim, forcing Mara Vance to flick her scope a hair to compensate before she squeezed off the round that dropped the heavy gunner across his own weapon. 3 targets gone in barely half a minute. And now the ambushers finally understood. Someone had slipped into their flank. A cluster of fighters redirected their fire toward her position, unleashing a sheet of rounds that shredded the air above her and carved jagged craters into the rocky lip of the depression. She pressed herself tight to the dirt, hearing Chief Rowan Hale's voice crackle through the radio. "Vance, status." "Still breathing," she replied, surprisingly calm despite the metal storm ripping overhead. "Their left flank is falling apart. Push forward and you'll get a window." "Negative. We've got wounded." His voice vanished under the roar of another explosion tearing through the convoy's center. Mara risked a glance and saw thick smoke curling off the wreckage of one of the transports, the entire situation tightening like a noose. If they didn't break contact soon, the 620 SEALs trapped in that kill box would be overrun. She brought her scope back up, sorting targets by threat. The ones manning heavy weapons, the ones issuing orders, the ones shifting angles to hit the remaining vehicles. Her rifle barked again and again, each shot surgical, every impact decisive. She wasn't spraying. She wasn't guessing. She was dismantling the ambush spine by spine. Her magazine clicked empty, and she swapped it out without lifting her eye from the glass, muscle memory turning her hands into separate tools. The enemy's once tight pattern of fire was unraveling. Openings appeared where minutes ago there were none. Fighters were hesitating now, shifting based on panic instead of orders, and fear made people predictable. "Hail," she said into the mic as she rose to move again. "I'm pushing higher. When you hear me firing from the next ridge, drive that convoy forward as fast as possible. No stops, no checks, just move. Vance, hold your position." But she didn't wait for approval. She was already sprinting uphill while friendly suppressive fire stitched chaos across the ridges. Her legs burned under 50 pounds of gear, sweat stinging her eyes despite the cold mountain air. Stopping wasn't an option. Stopping meant failing everyone depending on her. She reached a jagged outcropping and dropped into prone, the entire kill zone unfolding beneath her like a grim map. From this height she saw everything: the jammed convoy, the enemy's fire lanes, the choke points, the terrain boxing everyone in. As soon as she settled, her breathing evened out, her heartbeat steadied, and the roar of battle faded into a distant hum as she slipped into that razor-edged shooting state where nothing existed but the target. She worked with cold precision, taking out the worst threats first. Center mass hits on the fighters closest to the choke point, clean headshots for anyone using cover, and perfectly timed lead shots for the ones sprinting along the ridge. Panic rippled through the enemy ranks as bodies dropped one after another with disturbing consistency. They couldn't see her, couldn't trace the angle of the punishing fire. To them, she wasn't a sniper at all. She was a ghost tearing holes straight through their ambush. Some fighters broke and ran, and she let them go. She wasn't here to pad numbers. She was here to get Americans out alive. Anyone still firing at the convoy, though? She erased without hesitation. Below her, the remaining vehicles finally started grinding forward, engines roaring, gunners still lashing back at the ridgelines. They were damaged, bleeding, but they were moving, and movement meant survival. Mara covered every inch of their advance. RPG gunner, down. Machine gun team setting up a new position, gone. 2 fighters rushing to cut off the exit lane, both dropped. Another magazine empty. Another reload done automatically, her fingers moving purely on muscle memory. 12 rounds left in this one. Maybe her last full mag before she'd have to ration shots. The convoy was seconds away from slipping out of the kill box, and then the enemy tried their final move. A fighter suddenly rose from a hidden crack, directly in the convoy's path. RPG already shouldered. The rocket was armed and seconds from erasing one of the outbound vehicles and everyone inside. At that range, the man couldn't miss. Mara Vance's scope locked onto him instantly, her crosshairs hovering over the tiny slice of his head and shoulders sticking above the rock. Nearly 400 meters, nowhere near easy, but she steadied her breath, let half of it slip out, and froze the rest inside her chest. Her world shrank to a pinpoint of concentration as her finger settled onto the trigger. The rifle kicked. The fighter folded like a marionette with its strings cut, his RPG clattering harmlessly to the dirt without ever firing. Beneath her, the massive column of SEALs thundered past the kill zone's final choke point and spilled into the wider stretch of valley. Finally out of immediate danger, Mara stayed prone, sweeping the ridges for stragglers. Anyone still alive was already melting back into the rocks, unwilling to challenge an unseen shooter who had shredded their entire ambush. The kill box was broken. The trap had failed, and the Americans were getting out. She pressed her radio. Hale, you're clear. I'm moving to rejoin. Negative, Vance, Rowan Hale snapped back. Stay where you are. We're coming for you. No hero stunts. We've got wounded who need evac. I can make my way down. Not happening. Hold position. That's an order. The corner of her mouth tugged upward despite the exhaustion pulling at every muscle. SEALs always protected their own, even when their own was an intel specialist who had just saved several hundred operators from being wiped out. She checked the valley one last time, confirmed the danger had passed, then dropped into a low crouch and reloaded with hands as steady as if she were alone on a training range. 38 rounds left. Not perfect, but enough to discourage anyone stupid enough to come after her. The adrenaline that had kept her sharp began to bleed off, replaced by the crushing heaviness that always followed a fight like this, making her limbs feel twice their weight. Her body reminded her she'd sprinted uphill through 300 meters of gunfire and then held a 20-minute shooting duel she should not have survived. But she had, and so had hundreds of her teammates. Engine noise echoed from below. The convoy was returning, one armored transport breaking off and grinding its way up the ridge toward her. Mara rose slowly, slung her rifle, and began moving down to meet them. The aftermath was brutal. The vehicle that reached her belonged to the second transport element driven by Petty Officer Second Class Ryan Torres, who leaned out the window with dried blood and dirt streaking his face from a cut above his eyebrow. "You're either the bravest person I've ever met or completely insane," he said with a tired grin. "Maybe both." Mara climbed into the passenger seat without ceremony. "Just doing my job." "Not like that, you aren't." He dropped the truck into gear and eased it back down the ridge. 12 years doing this. Never seen anyone shoot like that. Nobody shoots like that. She didn't respond, just stared out at the torn landscape sliding past. Below them lay the shredded ambush site, equipment scattered everywhere, brass glittering in the sun, dark stains marking where the fighting hit hardest. Evidence that would wash off the stone long before it left anyone's memory. A kilometer ahead, the reassembled convoy sat in a defensive perimeter. Medics worked over the wounded. Radios buzzed with higher command demanding updates. And the vehicle hit by the opening RPG still smoldered, burned down to a total loss. As Torres rolled into the line, Chief Rowan Hale was already striding toward them, jaw tight, expression carved from granite. But something else flickered in his eyes. Gratitude, disbelief, and that quiet look soldiers get when they've witnessed something they can't fully grasp. "Vance," he said, as she stepped down from the truck. "We need to talk." They moved just far enough from the others for privacy, while still staying close enough to remain under security. Hale studied her for a long moment before speaking. "That might be the finest shooting I've seen in my entire career," he said, without softening a word. "And I've worked with some of SOCOM's best marksmen. So explain to me, how does an intel analyst outshoot every sniper I've trained?" Mara Vance had been expecting this conversation. Doing something extraordinary always dragged questions up from far above most people's clearance levels. "I qualify with my rifle like everybody else," she said evenly. "Don't do that," Hale snapped. "Qualification is hitting targets at 200 meters on a friendly range. What you did today was long-distance precision under fire, with bad angles, bad wind, and moving targets. You don't learn that by punching a scorecard once a year." She held his stare without blinking. "Then maybe you should ask yourself why someone with my skill set is officially assigned to a desk," she said quietly. Hale's eyes narrowed as the realization finally clicked into place. You're not just Navy, he murmured. I'm whatever the Navy needs me to be on any given day, she replied, her tone flat, almost rehearsed. Petty Officer First Class, Intelligence Analysis. That's what the paperwork says. That's who I am. He recognized the wall she'd just raised, the kind you didn't push against unless you wanted to lose your job or something far worse. Militaries lived on compartments inside compartments, jobs that didn't officially exist, programs buried under layers no one admitted were real. If Mara belonged to one of those shadows, digging would only cause damage. Right, he said softly. Intel analysis. My mistake. No mistake, Chief. Just operational security. He gave a slow nod. Well, you saved a hell of a lot of people today. I did my job. If your job is pulling SEAL teams out of an ambush, you're terrifyingly good at it. Mara allowed herself the faintest smile. I'll include that in my after-action notes. Proof the training works. Lieutenant Commander Brex Dalton joined them then, his uniform torn and streaked with someone else's blood. His expression carried the weight of fresh loss, but the forced composure of a man holding himself together by will alone. Final numbers, he reported tightly. 3 KIA, 7 wounded. Could have been far worse, Hale replied, nodding toward Mara. If Vance hadn't done what she did, we'd be talking about a wiped-out battalion. Dalton studied her like he was seeing her for the first time. I owe you an apology, he said. When you volunteered, I thought you wanted a resume booster. I was wrong. Nothing to apologize for, sir. You had no way of knowing. I should have, he muttered. Your file hit my desk with more blacked-out lines than a CIA briefing. I figured it was bureaucracy. Clearly it wasn't. Mara gave no explanation. Sometimes silence was the safest answer. Whatever you actually do when you're not analyzing intel, Dalton said quietly. I hope someone up the chain understands your value, because today was extraordinary. Someone does, Mara replied. That's enough. 20 minutes later, the medevac Blackhawks thundered low over the valley, door gunners scanning the cliffs. The wounded were loaded with clinical speed. The 3 who didn't survive were handled with solemn precision, bodies zipped into bags and moved with the kind of reverence only earned on days like this. Mara stepped back, watching the controlled chaos, knowing this part never made it into official reports. The cleanup, the triage, the quiet heartbreak, the faces of the injured, the weight of the dead, the understanding that somewhere families would soon hear a knock that would break them. Torres approached as the helicopters lifted off, rotor wash hammering the air. Word is you dropped at least 15 fighters, he said. Maybe more. I didn't count. Shooters always count. She met his stare. Then let's say I stopped counting once everyone had a chance to live. That's the only number that matters. He watched her for a long moment, as if trying to decipher something behind her calm expression. Who are you, really? He finally asked. Mara kept her face neutral. Petty Officer First Class Mara Vance, Intelligence Analysis? Yeah, Torres snorted. The official line. I get it. He shook his head. But someday, when all that classified stuff finally sees daylight, I want the real version. She let a small grin slip through. If that day ever comes, I'll buy the first round and tell you everything. I'm holding you to that. An hour later, the convoy reformed. 1 vehicle short, many seats empty, and a mood heavy with the weight that settles after narrowly escaping death. Everyone still moved with mission focus, but the silence carried the truth of loss. Mara slid back into the same vehicle she'd started in. Torres took the wheel, and Chief Rowan Hale climbed into the passenger seat. They pushed out along an alternate route cleared by a quick reaction force the moment the ambush was reported. No one was willing to gamble on the same road twice. As they rolled out, Hale turned toward her. "One more thing," he said. "Go ahead. When you were sprinting between cover points back there, bullets were slicing that kill zone from every direction. How were you that calm?" Mara considered her answer. "Because panic gets you killed. Fear is information. It tells you where the danger is. Accept that, and you can think clearly enough to move through it. They don't teach that in boot camp." "No," she agreed. "They don't. So where'd you learn it?" She gave him a flat look. "Classified, Chief." He let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Figures. Everything about you is classified." "Not everything," she said lightly. "I take my coffee black. No clearance required." "Good," he muttered. "We're finally sharing valuable intel." The convoy eventually reached the forward operating base without further contact. Passing through the gates brought a slow unwinding of the tension coiled inside Mara's ribs. They hadn't all made it, but enough had. And in this line of work, sometimes that was the closest thing to victory anyone ever got. The debrief lasted nearly 3 hours. Mara sat in a cramped room with Hale, Dalton, and 2 intelligence officers as they documented every detail of the ambush, the enemy's setup, their tactics, the convoy's response. She kept her answers precise, sticking strictly to what she had observed: ranges, wind shifts, ammunition use, angles, timing. She gave them the mechanics of shooting without touching the emotional cost of what shooting meant. The intel officers jotted down every detail without probing into her training or background. Either they already knew more than they could admit, or someone had warned them not to cross certain lines. For that, Mara was quietly grateful. When the session finally wrapped, Dalton stopped her at the door. "One more thing," he said. "What you did today is going into my report, and I'm recommending you for a commendation." "That's not necessary, sir." "It is," he insisted. "Good work deserves recognition. My work is most effective when it stays unrecognized." He gave a thin, exhausted smile. "Then I'll make sure it's classified at the right level. But it's going in. Vance, you earned it." She dipped her head, knowing pushing back any further would come off as disrespect. "Thank you, sir." Outside, the sun was sinking behind the base, throwing the sky into streaks of purple and orange. Mara walked slowly toward her quarters, the day's weight finally settling deep into her bones. Every muscle throbbed. Her ears still rang from the hours of gunfire, and she could already feel the deep bruises forming where her plate carrier had absorbed impacts on her climb up the ridge. But she was alive, and hundreds of them were alive. And tomorrow, they'd all do it again. Her quarters were simple: a cot, a footlocker, a small desk, and a laptop protected behind layers of encryption. Tonight, it looked like the most welcoming place on earth. She leaned her rifle against the wall, then eased herself onto the cot and slowly stripped off her gear piece by piece. The plate carrier came first, the ceramic plates scarred by rounds she'd barely registered at the time. Then came her battle belt, pouches, med kit, all the small tools that separated life from death out there. Down to her base uniform, she allowed her eyes to close briefly. Behind her eyelids, she could still see the kill zone, still feel the recoil of each shot, still sense the exact moment her crosshairs settled over every target before she chose to fire. Those images slid quietly into the long mental archive of violence she carried, not something she bragged about, not something she regretted, just the truth of the path she'd accepted. Someone had to stand in that space between chaos and the people who needed protection. Today, that someone happened to be her. A knock pulled her from her thoughts. "It's open," she called. Torres stepped inside with 2 steaming cups of coffee. He handed her one without a word. She wrapped her hands around the heat. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked. "Won't be sleeping for a while," he admitted, lowering himself into the room's only chair. "Every time I blink, I see that RPG hit the truck. The blast, the fire. And I keep thinking, if we'd been half a minute slower, if you hadn't been there." "But I was there," she cut in gently. "And you weren't 30 seconds slower." What ifs don't help anyone. He stared into his coffee like it held answers. "How do you do it? Go through something like that and then sit here like it's normal?" "It's not normal," she said softly. "It's necessary. That's different. So why'd you volunteer for a route like that? You had to know it was bad news." "Because someone had to go," she said simply. "And I had skills that could make a difference." Torres looked up. "You know what Hale's saying? He says you're the best combat shooter he's ever seen. And he's worked with legends." Mara shrugged lightly. "He exaggerates." "No, he doesn't. Rowan Hale doesn't exaggerate." He leaned closer. "So I'm asking again. Who are you really? Because the you on paper doesn't match the you in reality." She took a sip, giving him a piece of truth she could safely offer. "I'm someone trained for a very specific job. That job requires certain skills. Shooting is one of them. When those skills are needed, I use them. And the job itself? Classified," she said simply. "It's not just intel. It's whatever the mission demands that day." Torres nodded slowly, letting that land. "Then whoever trained you must be damn good." "The best," she said quietly. "They taught me to shoot like that. And a lot more." He exhaled sharply. "Well, I'm glad you ended up with us today. Whatever your real role is, I'm glad it put you on that convoy." "Me too," she admitted. They finished their coffee in silence, a warm silence, not a heavy one. When Torres finally stood, he paused at the door. "For what it's worth, if you ever need backup for the next classified thing you get dragged into, I'd volunteer." "I'll remember that," she said. When he left, Mara sat alone, finishing the last of her coffee as the day replayed in her mind. The choices, the shots, all the branching possibilities that could have ended differently. She'd made the right calls, and the results proved it. But the weight didn't vanish just because she'd been right. Every life she'd taken had been necessary, legal within the rules of engagement. But necessity didn't erase the reality that she had ended lives. That truth stayed. This was the part people never talked about. The psychological toll. Even when the violence was justified, it layered quietly over the years like sediment, and eventually you had to learn how to carry it. Some couldn't. Some cracked under it. Some froze when they needed to pull the trigger again. She'd watched that happen to people who seemed stronger on paper than she'd ever considered herself. But somehow, Mara was still holding it together, still carrying it, still able to do the job. She was still here, still bearing everything the work demanded, still willing to step forward whenever the moment called for it. Her secure phone buzzed, an encrypted message from a contact listed only as command. The text was brief. "Well done. Full debrief when you return to main base. Travel orders incoming." She typed a simple acknowledgement, wiped both messages from the device, and let the future unfold at its own pace. Whatever came next would come next. For now, she needed sleep. Mara set the empty coffee cup on the desk, kicked off her boots, and stretched out on the cot, fully dressed. Despite the ringing in her ears and the fading adrenaline, sleep took her almost instantly, and her dreams stayed mercifully blank. 3 days later, she boarded a crowded C-130 heading back to the primary installation. The plane was packed with personnel rotating out of forward positions, and she sat near the rear ramp with her rifle case braced between her knees, watching the jagged terrain slide beneath them from 30,000 feet. From up here, Corval looked deceptively peaceful, brown ridges folding into valleys, silver ribbons of rivers cutting through the earth, clusters of small villages clinging to water sources. From this altitude, it was easy to forget how fast those same valleys could ignite. A young Marine corporal next to her kept sneaking glances at her rifle case until he finally worked up the nerve. "That custom work?" "Yeah," she said. "You a sniper?" "I shoot when shooting needs to be done." He laughed awkwardly. "That's not much of an explanation." "It's the only one I'm cleared to give." "Classified stuff, huh?" "The classy kind," she said, and he broke into a real laugh. "I'm Jake," he added. "Just finished my first deployment." "Mara," she replied. "Not my first." "Any advice for a newbie?" he asked, and Mara didn't treat the question lightly. He looked barely 19, still at that age when combat sounded like a story someone else lived, not something that carved years off your soul. He didn't need fantasy. He needed honesty. "Stay humble," she said at last. "The moment you think you've figured everything out is the moment you make the mistake that kills you. Listen to the veterans. Take care of your gear and your people. And never count on luck. Luck runs out." Jake nodded slowly. "Anything else?" "Yeah. Know why you're here? When things get bad, and they will, you'll need a reason stronger than an order, something that anchors you." He hesitated before asking, "What's your reason?" Mara looked out the window at the mountains sliding beneath them. "Because someone has to be willing to do the hard things so others don't have to. That's enough for me." The plane began banking toward the main airbase, ending the conversation as everyone opened their packs and checked their gear. She tapped her rifle case once more and leaned back in her seat. The main base dwarfed the forward positions, concrete instead of canvas, hardened buildings instead of makeshift posts. A strange sense of stability despite the war humming around it. Her travel orders led her to an unmarked building near the intelligence wing. After clearing multiple checkpoints and presenting her ID to 3 different guards, she was escorted deep inside to a small, windowless conference room. A woman waited for her, civilian attire, military spine, sharp eyes in her mid-40s, a face carved into neutrality. Her badge hung backward on purpose, concealing her identity. "Petty Officer Vance," the woman said. "Have a seat." Mara sat, setting her rifle case neatly beside her. "I've reviewed the convoy reports," the woman continued. "Your performance was exceptional. Lieutenant Commander Dalton praised you highly." "I did what needed to be done," Mara replied. "You did significantly more than that," the woman said in a measured tone. "You single-handedly dismantled an ambush that should have obliterated an entire convoy." She opened a folder and scanned pages Mara couldn't see. 15 confirmed kills, some at nearly 400 meters under fire, in shifting wind with moving targets. Precision at that level is rare even for our specialized personnel. "Thank you," Mara answered quietly. "Here's the problem," the woman went on, her voice tightening. "Exceptional performance draws attention, and attention is not ideal for someone with your specialty." Mara had known this conversation was inevitable. The alternative had been letting Americans die. "I'm not criticizing your actions," the woman said. "You made the right call. You saved lives. That will always take priority. But now we have SEALs asking who you really are. We have reports circulating that will reach very high levels. In short, we have visibility." "What do you recommend?" Mara asked. The woman shut the folder. "Your cover as an intelligence analyst is still viable, but everyone from that convoy is going to question it. So we're pulling you back to the States for reassignment. You'll retain your official role, but we'll be more deliberate about when and where you're deployed for special assignments." "When do I leave?" "Transport is already arranged. Wheels up tomorrow morning." She studied Mara's expression, searching for any crack or emotional tell. She found none. "You're handling this better than most," she observed. "I always knew this posting was temporary," Mara said. "Most operators hate being pulled from a combat zone." "You almost sound relieved." Mara considered. "Not relieved about leaving. Relieved I did what needed to be done. Whatever comes next, comes next." A faint smile touched the woman's lips. "That mindset will take you far. Maintain it, and you'll have a long career." She stood and extended her hand. "Exceptional work, Petty Officer." They shook, her grip firm, practiced, controlled. "One more thing," Mara said before the woman stepped out. "The Marines who died out there, will their families get the full truth?" The woman paused. "They will receive what we are authorized to provide, that their loved ones died in combat, that they were heroes, that their actions mattered." She lifted a shoulder. "The exact specifics remain classified, even from families, especially from families. Operational security does not bend for grief." It wasn't the answer Mara wanted, but it was the one she expected. In this world, truth came with clearance levels, restrictions, and redactions. Even death had classification requirements. The rest of her time on base passed quickly. She packed her gear, filed her final reports, and said quiet goodbyes to the handful of people who knew her well enough to deserve them. Most of her real work had been solitary. Missions without witnesses, victories measured in sealed envelopes and whispered acknowledgments. On her last evening, she walked the outer perimeter while the sun dipped behind the mountains. The peaks glowed deep purple and molten gold, beautiful in that harsh way dangerous places often were. She'd spent months here maintaining the dual life of an analyst and something far more classified, keeping up the fiction on paper while doing the work that mattered. It had been exhausting, necessary, and meaningful, and now it was ending. At least this chapter was. Torres found her near the flight line, where crews were prepping helicopters for night operations. "Heard your wheels up tomorrow?" he said. "News travels fast," she replied. "Small world out here." "Smaller when someone does what you did." He scuffed the dirt with his boot. "We're going to miss having you around. Felt safer knowing you were watching our backs." "You'll manage," Mara said. "Hale is a solid chief. Dalton knows what he's doing. And you've got good people." "We did," Torres said quietly. "Then we lost 3 of them because we walked straight into an ambush." His voice carried the heavy, familiar weight of survivor's guilt. "If you hadn't been there—" "But I was," she said softly. "That's what matters." "Is it?" he asked, meeting her eyes. 3 families are about to get visits that will destroy them. 3 sets of parents or spouses or kids are about to have their lives shattered. And the only reason there aren't more is because you volunteered for a convoy you didn't even officially belong on. She understood what he was really asking. "You're looking for something bigger," she said gently. "Some reason why things unfold the way they do, but there isn't one. It's just people making choices and living with the consequences. I chose to volunteer. You made choices in the fight. The enemy made theirs. Those decisions collided. That's all it ever is. Decisions and consequences." "That's a cold way to see it," Torres murmured. "It's the only way to stay functional," she replied. "Start searching for cosmic meaning in chaos and you lose your balance fast." He took that in, then said, "The beer offer still stands. When all the classified stuff eventually comes out, I want the real story. I'll hold you to it." He extended his hand, and she shook it firmly. "Stay safe, Vance. Whatever comes next." "You too, Torres. Keep your head down and your powder dry." He chuckled at the old phrase before heading back toward the barracks. Mara watched him go, then turned toward the flight line. The Blackhawks were lifting into the night now, rotors thundering as they vanished into the darkness. Somewhere beyond that horizon, someone on those birds was flying straight into danger. Maybe their mission would go smoothly. Maybe it wouldn't. Uncertainty was the only rule that stayed consistent. Tomorrow she'd be on a transport back to the States, back to briefing rooms, classified tasks, training ranges, and the strange double life of someone whose official job barely resembled what she actually did. She went back to waiting for the next call, the next crisis, the next moment when her particular skill set would tilt a mission away from catastrophe and back toward survival. But tonight, she was still here, still watching over a base full of people she'd fought beside, still carrying the weight of the lives she'd saved and the lives she'd taken to save them. She watched the last helicopter vanish into the night, then turned toward her quarters. She still had packing to finish, logs to update, and a rifle to clean one final time before the long flight home. And beneath it all sat the quiet certainty that this strange, hidden, demanding life was exactly what she'd signed up for. 6 months later, Mara Vance stood on the firing line at Ashford Gorge, observing a class of new scout sniper candidates work through long-range shooting problems. The Virginia morning was crisp and bright, perfect conditions, which also meant they weren't learning how savage shooting became when nature fought you instead of helping you. Her new official assignment was Advanced Marksmanship Instructor, a convenient cover that let her train precision shooters while maintaining the illusion she was just another competent operator instead of someone who'd spent years in programs most Marines would never even hear whispers about. The students were solid, raw but solid. They had discipline, decent fundamentals, and the hunger to improve. What they lacked was experience, the kind you only gained when bullets were slicing past your ribs. "Vance," a familiar voice called. She turned to see Master Gunnery Sergeant Keller approaching, deep lines around his eyes folding into a smile. Keller was 53 and had forgotten more about precision shooting than most experts ever learned. He'd overseen her earliest sniper development and had been the first person to realize Mara Vance had a gift that didn't fit into any normal framework. "Gunny," she greeted. "Didn't expect to see you out here." "Heard you were back stateside," he said. "Wanted to see how my top student's handling the instructor life." He nodded toward the shooters. "Not a bad class." "They will be when I'm done with them," she said, and Keller chuckled. "Still confident as ever." His tone shifted. "Also heard rumors. Something unusual in Corval Valley. Low casualties thanks to some ridiculous long-range work from an intel analyst who supposedly isn't trained for combat." Mara kept her face neutral, rumors grow legs. I figured, Keller said. But I made a call to an old friend in SOCOM. He said the after-action read like fiction, for people cleared to see it. I can't comment on classified operations. Wouldn't expect you to. Keller's voice softened. Just wanted you to know I'm proud of you. Whatever you've been doing behind the curtains, you're doing it at a level most shooters couldn't even dream about. Coming from him, that meant something real. Thank you, Gunny. Take care of yourself, he said. People like you, we don't get many. World needs you sharp. He walked off, leaving Mara with her thoughts and her students. During the next break, a young lance corporal named Hayes hurried over, eager, wide-eyed, untouched by combat. Ma'am, he said, yesterday you talked about reading terrain and how it affects ballistics. The way you explained it, it sounded like you can predict drift before you fire. How's that possible? Mara considered the question. The truth was messy, a mix of brutal experience, thousands of rounds in every imaginable condition, and instincts honed by repetition most Marines would never reach. It's pattern recognition, she said. Shoot enough rounds